the truth behind foliar feeding, not just some mumbo-jumbo pseudoscience that someone's giving you from having read an AOS article about foliar feeding that was probably written back in the 70s. Welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're going to be looking at the facts behind foliar feeding, what it's going to do for your plant, how to go about it, and which orchids it is going to work on the best. If this is the kind of information you are interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. So, foliar feeding, as you can probably tell by the intro, something I'm quite passionate about, and I don't understand why the people who are saying foliar feeding does not work don't actually read the facts. Why they don't do just a modicum of research so they're actually giving the facts to people. Instead of just purely saying, oh, I read that orchids have a cuticle, the cuticle is impervious to water, so it's pointless giving them food. Well, actually look at it more carefully. Don't you think nature is a little bit more intelligent than that? Orchids have been adapting themselves to growing in epiphytic environments for thousands of years. And do you think they're just going to have a single way of drawing in nutrients? It really doesn't make any sense, just from the basic common sense perspective. So let's look into what the real science says about foliar feeding and orchids. Yes, orchids do have a cuticle, which is a thick waxy layer. Some orchids, it's more prominent than others. For instance, your Phalaenopsis. But that does not mean that that cuticle layer is not going to absorb nutrients or moisture through it. It's specifically been designed by nature to hold moisture into the orchid leaf itself. But that doesn't mean it's not going to allow the ingress of moisture and nutrients through it while still preventing evaporation out. So the researchers have been hard at work, and they have proven that this cuticle is able to allow small molecules to pass through the surface and enter the leaf while still stopping that evaporation from happening. And these small molecules can be in the form of small molecules of water, such as water vapor, which is especially prevalent in those high humidities. Also, those small nutrient molecules are also easily able to pass through this cuticle. Just to understand this a little bit more, orchids coming from those very nutrient deficient and often water deficient environments, they've had to come up with complicated methods in how to keep both nutrients and moisture in the plant while still being able to get it. So this waxy cuticle layer has developed a way of allowing for absorption of fine particles of water and those small nutrients, meaning by foliar feeding, you're almost emulating the effect that's going to happen in its natural environment. Indeed, there are certain aspects to it that are going to affect the ability of this cuticle layer to be able to absorb those nutrients and the water. Things like humidity and temperature, these play an important role in it, because not only are they going to affect the opening and closing of stomata, which we'll get to just now, but they'll also affect the leaf itself. For instance, things like withering. Withering of the leaves is actually going to make that cuticle layer a lot more permeable because those cells aren't turgid any longer. They start to lose volume and they contract away from each other, which allows for faster ingress of moisture. This will help in the initial stages in getting moisture into the leaf itself so that the plant can then overcome that moisture deficiency. So in those early stages, giving it a certain amount of foliar application of water will help the plant maintain its moisture content and cause less stress. But of course, If that stress continues for too long and the leaves start getting really limp, what can start happening is you'll get micro cracks in your cuticle itself, which will be good for allowing water in because it will be easier access into the plant, but it's uncontrollable. It's not then able to control the exit of water at the same time. So if your humidity levels are too low and you're trying to add extra moisture in, it can possibly just be evaporating straight out of the leaf just as fast, if not faster, than what you're able to replace it with. And then if you're supplying any nutrients at that point as well, perhaps your plant is going to be more focused on its survival than on the saving of that particular leaf. So it may be moving the nutrients and moisture out of that leaf to other areas of the plant it's going to use to keep itself alive. And also you've got to be particularly careful at those points as well, because by supplying too much moisture, if your temperatures are high, you may be giving bacteria and fungus direct access into your plant itself. So it's always best to catch it before it gets to that sort of point. That's why foliar feeding can be a lifesaver in those early stages of dehydration stress. It allows for fast, easy access to nutrients and moisture where the plant needs it, making it a highly effective remedy. Foliar feeding through the cuticle is particularly effective at supplying micronutrients and nitrogen, but not all forms of nitrogen, specifically nitrogen in the form of urea. Urea is a small enough molecule to be able to be absorbed through that cuticle. And as I've explained to you before, orchids have an enzyme called urease, which specifically breaks urea into a form of nitrogen that the orchids can use. But always remember, when using urea, make sure your quantities are very low, because urea can burn your plants. So ensure, especially with foliar feeding, that you're feeding at very low concentration, but you can feed frequently. Now, let's look at that stomata and how they're going to affect your foliar feeding. And another excuse people use not to foliar feed is that they say, oh, a lot of orchids use the CAM pathway for metabolism, and that's not appropriate for foliar feeding because your stomata only open in the evenings. They're only open at night, and that's when your CO2 fixation happens. And so when you come to feed your orchids during the day, the stomata are closed and you're not going to get any of those nutrients in. There's just a few little things that they're not looking at there. During that CAM pathway, your stomata are still open in the early mornings and in the late afternoons. So you still have a chance then and there to give that foliar feed. Remember, stomata are generally on the underside of the orchid. This is to help reduce any evaporation that may take place through them. So when you foliar feeding, remember to spray the undersides as well as the top. But also another thing with these CAM pathway orchids is they don't only open their stomata at night. If your humidity levels and your temperature levels are right, your stomata will be open during the day as well, because the orchid knows there's enough moisture in the environment itself that it's not going to be losing too much through transpiration. So if you manage your humidity levels, you can still foliar feed just about whenever you want to, because the most vigorous growth phases that happen in your orchid are at the point where photosynthesis and transpiration are happening at the same time. This provides the most energy for the plant and allows the fastest, most vigorous growth points. So this makes foliar feeding particularly good, because you're supplying lots of nutrients in small quantities constantly to allow for that growth to happen. Feeding it all those good nutrients so that it can grow healthy and vigorous. The best way of foliar feeding is ensuring you have a spray bottle that can give a nice fine spray. You almost want to be misting your plant, and you're misting both the top side and the underside of the leaves of your whole plant. And you're just doing it before runoff point. So you're just spraying enough to ensure you have a very fine moisture coating on the top of your leaf. So you're providing moisture and nutrients to the parts of the plant that need it the most. And that's one of the reasons that it's so effective in helping those leaves as they are starting to dehydrate, giving you immediate moisture and nutrients to help bring it back to life. Because often as that desiccation starts to happen, so your vascular system becomes compromised, making it less easy for moisture and nutrients to get to those parts of the plants. So foliar feeding is going to be a big help there. Also, if you've got some nutrient deficiencies, foliar feeding is going to help rectify the problem a lot faster than feeding through the roots, providing the nutrients at the areas that it's needed. Always remember, there's no quick fix when it comes to nutrient deficiencies. It may take a long time for your plant to show recovery. More on that in an upcoming video. So now that we know when, where, and how to do foliar feeding and that it is effective, let's look at which orchids it is going to be the most effective on, and on those that it may be slightly less effective on, how can we overcome it? The epiphytic orchids that are particularly responsive to foliar feeding are your dendrobiums, your cattleyas, oncidiums, and vandas. They react particularly well because you're almost mimicking what happens in their natural habitat. If you are giving them high humidity, between 50 and 80%, it will be easy to notice how effective foliar feeding is on them. With cattleyas also, with cattleyas, that cardboardy texture on their leaves makes the spray particularly adhere to the plant extremely well. This helps keeping the moisture on the plant for longer to allow for the plant to absorb the moisture and the nutrients. With the oncidiums, those nice fine thin leaves have a really thin cuticle, are able to absorb the moisture relatively quickly. And with vandas, we all know that they have all those air roots, and those have to be sprayed anyway. And in those warm, humid climates, those stomata are going to be open, and they're going to be absorbing in all that extra nutrient and moisture that is available to them. This is going to help reduce the dehydration stress that is applied to them because of the higher temperatures. And with your terrestrial orchids, your Paphiopedilums and Phragmipediums, they also react particularly well to foliar feeding because of their thin cuticles and their thinner leaves. Also, they generally grow in very nutrient-poor soils and actually prefer it that way. So by giving them a foliar feed, it helps get more nutrition and moisture into the plant to help it avoid both dehydration and nutrient deficiencies. Fast-growing orchids like Cymbidiums and even some of those fast-growing dendrobiums also particularly act well to foliar feeding. It just gives them the extra nutrition as quickly as possible to help with their continued growth, to ensure that the growth is strong, vibrant, and healthy. It also ensures that your orchids are getting enough of this nutrition not only for their growth, but for their storage as well, so that they can store the moisture and nutrition for those times to last them through the dormant periods or their times of hardship, and then still allow them to burst into flower then afterwards or carry on with strong, vigorous growth. But do understand it's going to be pointless foliar feeding any of these orchids that are in their dormant phase already. For one, we don't want to be adding any extra moisture or nutrition to them during those phases to allow them to rest. We can't forget those orchids that are slightly less responsive. Things with their big thick cuticles like your Phalaenopsis and your vanilla planifolia. Their thick waxy cuticles still do allow for it to absorb moisture and those small nutrients through the surface at a very much slower rate. Also, the very smooth texture that they have makes the water run off a lot faster. So if we are foliar feeding, we want to give them very light sprays, and we may want to add a surfactant in it to help get the moisture to stick in place. But One of the reasons that often it's not suggested to foliar feed your Phalaenopsis is because you're supplying moisture to the top, and as I said, with these shiny smooth leaves, that water is going to run down into the crown and in between the leaves, and that can very likely lead to crown rot. So perhaps on Phalaenopsis, foliar feeding can be used, but to a much lesser extent. So the 4 considerations you have to take into account to ensure that you're getting the most out of your foliar feeding is, for one, the humidity. Ensure that you have the right humidity for your orchids to ensure that there's no moisture stress on them. This is going to allow for those stomata to stay open longer and allow for more of the moisture and nutrients in your foliar spray to get into the plant. 2, the correct formulation of your feed. Ensure that your nitrogen is in the form of urea, but also ensure that your concentrations are very low. We don't want to burn the plant with excess nutrients. Using a quarter or less, or ensuring you're using an organic fertilizer to fertilize your orchids to avoid any nutrient burn. So low concentrations. And then the timing of your application is going to be important. The best timing for it is in the mornings or in the late afternoons. This is also to ensure that if your humidity levels aren't correct, that you're going to have open stomata available to you to apply that moisture immediately. So not only is it going to be absorbed in through the cuticle, but you're going to get all that extra moisture and nutrients in through the stomata too. So that's why you're going to have to be sure that you're spraying the undersides of your leaves as well. And then number 4, your new growth. The new leaves that are coming out and any of that new growth that's happening is going to be more responsive to your foliar feed than the older growth. For one, the newer growth is what needs more moisture and nutrients than the older growth anyway, but the older growth, often lignin has already started to form in those cell walls, and it's going to be less likely for any absorption to take place. And your orchid may already be removing nutrients from those older areas to bring to the newer growth. As with the process of growing, the orchid will eventually let go of those older sections and let them die off. I hope this has allowed you to understand the process of foliar feeding a lot better. Please don't be scared of it. It is an important part of our care regime. And if you have any other questions, please check out that Buy Me a Coffee link down below. Ed posts a lot of orchid content on there continually. Don't be shy. Sign up, become a member, help us look after our orchids, and learn to grow like a pro. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.